let's quickly seize the moment while the Skype is working, and I'll make very quick introductory remarks and then quickly try to get to our panelists. And I think we'll start with Danish while he's still with us. And hopefully load shedding will cooperate and they will not get disconnected during the next hour and a half discussion. But anyway, thank you all for coming to USIP. My name's Andrew Wilder. I'm the director of our Afghanistan and Pakistan programs here. I think we have a very important discussion today on the water security nexus in Pakistan. Certainly a major area of concern. I think because overuse and misuse of water, Pakistan's really facing a declining, availability of good quality water, water pollution issues, a lot of, in the context of overall environmental insecurity. By 2030, the UN expects Pakistan to decline from being water stressed to water scarce. I think one of the interesting contributions of this paper, for at least when I was reading through it, was my reading on, and what I've read in other papers recently, has a lot of the focus has been on the interstate conflicts generated by water, in particular in terms of Indo-Pak issues. That said, I think there probably hasn't been enough attention to some of the AFPAC water issues, which I think are going to loom in the future. But India and Pakistan issue has gotten a lot of attention. But I think certainly from what I'm reading, and I'm not an expert in this field, but a lot less attention to the intrastate water issues in Pakistan. And I think that is, in some ways generate, a much bigger source of current conflict now and tensions and political tensions in particular. So I think that's a very important contribution of this paper. I also appreciate the fact that it really emphasizes how the importance of this, viewing this problem of water scarcity as a political issue and not just a technical issue. I think there has been a tendency to look at it as a supply issue at times, and more mega projects and a bit more supply driven, but also how do we look at the demand side of it and try to understand issues, the politics of distribution, allocation, and access. And so I certainly learned a lot from the paper, but without further ado, I'll turn it over to our panelists, and just to briefly introduce them. We'll be starting with Dr. Danish Mustafa, who's joining us currently from Islamabad, but he's a reader in politics and environment in the Department of Geography at King's College in London. His primary research interests focus on critical water resources and geography, social networks and environmental management, and related approaches to terrorism. He has worked in Pakistan for the nonprofit sector, and as well as donor-funded social development and environmental preservation projects. He has his PhD from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Our second speaker will be Dr. Majid Akhtar, who I'd like to congratulate for he just completed his dissertation a couple weeks ago and will be soon taking up a position as assistant professor of geography at Indiana University in Bloomington. Majid's broad research interests include water law and policy, the geography of economic development, and the politics, geopolitics, and history of Pakistan. Majid received his PhD just recently from the University of Arizona, and has his MSc in economics from LUMS in Lahore, the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Then last, we have Dr. Winston Yu, who is a senior water resources specialist at the World Bank in the South Asia region. And an indication of his passion and interest in this topic is that he has come out of paternity leave. He is a father as of about a week ago to join us today. So congratulations. Yes, I wasn't going to go speak. Yeah, as a father myself, I wasn't going to reveal the real reason. But his special interests include river basin management, hydrologic modeling, flood forecasting and management, groundwater hydrogeology, international rivers and transboundary issues, and adaptation to climate change. And prior to joining the bank, he was a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute and has served as a science and technology officer at the U.S. State Department. Dr. Yu has his PhD and a master's degree from Harvard University. I'd also like to acknowledge two others. Natalie Nasrallah, who's sitting in the front row, is one of the third author of this paper, and I think I'll turn to her for the first comment after the presentations. Last but not least, I'd like to also thank a former colleague, Dr. Raymond Gilpin, who headed our Center for Sustainable Economies here and is now the Dean of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at NDU. And he's the one who initiated this, this research project and managed the project until his departure from USIP. So I think I'll turn it over to you, Danish. I hope you're still with us at our USIP office in Islamabad. Yeah. Why don't we try to go sort of in the 10 to 12 minute range for opening remarks, and then we'll leave plenty of time for discussion, and you can make all your other points then. Looks like load shedding has kicked in again. Let's quickly see if they can get back. If not, then we'll move on to you, and then if we connect, we can go back to them. Are you back with us, Danish? Let's go on to you. Sorry about this. This was the original intended order, was to get the historical perspective a bit more first. But anyway, we'll hope to get Danish back to carry on after this. So turn over to you now.
Hello, Hello? Yeah. So thanks for everyone for coming out, and thanks to USIP for organizing this report, and thanks especially to my co-authors, Danish and Natalie, throughout this. So instead of kind of going over what's already in the report, which I hope that you guys will look at, I wanted to kind of spend more time developing one theme that we mentioned briefly but didn't quite get into because it's kind of an overview. And that theme is the link between water security and land distribution, land rights. More specifically, inequality in land distribution. So there's good reason to consider the link between water security and land, and that reason is that poverty and social security, when we talk about security in this report, we're not talking about security of armies and states, we're talking about the security of individual people, livelihoods and subsistence. So poverty is demonstrably directly related to access in land and agricultural economies like Pakistan. In Pakistan, about half of the labor force is in agriculture, and half of that agricultural labor force is landless. And landlessness rates are continuing to increase. Over the past 30 years, this is a trend we can see. And of course, the connection to water is that within an arid country like Pakistan, indeed anywhere, you can't have agricultural production without water. So land by its taken in isolation is missing half of the picture. You have to have water, especially in Pakistan. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I thought I would have 20 minutes, not 10, so I'm going to kind of give you a truncated version.
We'll give you 15.
15, okay. I'll take it. So basically what I'm going to suggest through this talk is that we kind of reconceptualize security in Pakistan, especially water security, and frame it as it's about direct access of the poorest and the most marginalized to the means of subsistence. So this is different from kind of a geopolitical or a military focus on security. We're talking more about direct access of the poorest and the most marginalized in that society to the means of subsistence. So I'll do this in 3 steps, and I'll go through these quickly. First, I'm going to give you a brief summary of land reforms in Pakistan. What we're talking about is land reforms, inequality in the distribution of land. Second, I'll look at how these reforms have dealt with water, because they were specifically land reforms, but they do engage with water kind of tangentially. And I'll critique how they look at water and suggest some new ways that we need to start thinking about the connection between land and water security. And then finally, the first thing which comes to people's minds when you discuss land reforms is political viability. So I'll end with a consideration of political viability of putting land reform back on the table. So for those, many of you might know, but for those of you who don't, there have been 3 land reforms in Pakistan in 1959, 1972, and 1977. In a nutshell, the prominent feature of these land reforms was to set ceilings on the amount of land holdings you could have but at the same time provide numerous loopholes for people to avoid those ceilings. 1959 and 72 reforms were implemented under martial law, and the 77 reform was aborted by a military coup by Zia al-Haq, which happened in the same year. So most people agreed that the land reforms were a good step, but they've had a very, very limited impact. And just to give you an idea of that, more land has changed hands informally after the tumult of partition after 47 than all three land reforms combined have redistributed. So more land has changed hands through informal means than formal means anyway. So just to give you an idea how limited the impact of these reforms have been. And in 1989, the Sharia appellate court to the Supreme Court in Pakistan actually declared that limits on land holdings is un-Islamic. So right now, all these land reforms are in abeyance. And I'll return to that in the conclusion, what that means for the political viability. So basically, just to cut down on time, we can cover this in the Q&A if you're interested, but the three land reforms that I've just discussed, for the most part, how they understand the connection between water and land is that water is a tool to make land more productive. That's the upshot. And these land reforms are actually geared not at security, not at ensuring the livelihoods of people, but actually for making farms more productive and more efficient. So these are not land reforms in the sense of a Maoist land reform that people might have in their minds. These are more about making farms more productive. And an example of that is that if you were to install a tube well, which is a groundwater pumping technology, or to employ tractors, the landholding ceilings would be forgiven. You know, that's one of the loopholes that I talked about. So these are land reforms which talk about water, but only in the sense that it could increase the yield per acre. You know, it's what Robert Wade, irrigation scholar, calls a productivist focus of water and on land, and understanding of irrigation. So what I want to suggest today is that fine, efficiency and productivity are great goals. I'm not saying they're not great goals. The link between efficiency and productivity to security of subsistence, however, is not confirmed theoretically or empirically. Oftentimes, when you make these kind of changes to increase efficiency and productivity, what you're assuming is that there's a perfect market waiting to kind of reallocate resources when everything is all said and done. And in Pakistan, of course, there is not a perfect market functioning. Nowhere in the world is there a perfect market functioning, especially in Pakistan. And especially when you're talking about water, which requires an infrastructure to deliver from point A to point B. So I think Robert Wade has in a book written now a couple decades ago, but still I think people need to pick up on, is that when you're talking about irrigation and water and land reform, what really the focus should be on securing employment and giving people secure employment and the access to subsistence, not on making farms more efficient and productive, which is a worthy goal, but that's not what we're after. We're talking about security. Okay, so just I'll turn back to the viability, because of course everyone questions the viability of land reforms, and with good reason. There's good reason why the land reforms in Pakistan's past have not been implemented fully, even weak as they were, even in the draft, they weren't implemented fully, and that's because of the so-called feudal power relations in Pakistan, and the landed parties control parliament, etc., etc. So let's just have a brief review of the political actors. In terms of political parties, of the major parties in Pakistan, only MQM in Karachi still talks about land reforms. And the reason is quite obvious, because they're in Karachi, because they're urban. Their power base is not in the countryside. So that's a very limited way forward in terms of political parties. In terms of law, I mentioned earlier that the Sharia appellate court has declared land reforms un-Islamic. I would argue that this has very shaky foundations in Islamic jurisprudence. And just to give you an example, in the early 50s, East Pakistan, which is today Bangladesh, implemented sweeping land reforms in the name of Islam. saying that Islam's focus is on equality and social welfare, and therefore, in the name of Islam, we conduct land reforms. Whereas in Pakistan, the opposite happened, that in the name of Islam, we revoke land reforms. So all I'm saying is that that's changeable. You know, that's something that can be argued and talked about, even though that appellate court passed down that decision. The military is dead set against land reforms, not least because they actually have active financial interests in land markets in Pakistan. Aisha Siddiqa's book is great on this. So basically, the hope that I see for putting land reforms back on the table comes actually from the working peasants of Pakistan. So if you know, there's a movement called the Anjuman Muzareen Punjab, the landless peasants movement of Punjab. It's a million-strong movement. Their landlords were the army 10 years ago, but they've actually taken over the land and refused to pay the army any share of their sharecropping, you know, kind of share to it. So far from the kind of established political players, I think we need to look at these people on the ground who are actually implementing land reforms right now. They're not waiting for courts, they're not waiting for anyone. These are some of the poorest people in the country, yet they've stood up to the military, their landlords. So rather than looking at political parties or think tanks or anything like this to lead, I think as intellectuals, academics, researchers, we need to take our cues from the people on the ground who are actually making these things happening and see what they think. What do you think about the relationship between land and water security? And we can talk about this a little bit more. They have had major issues with access to water in these lands that they've taken over from the army. So just to conclude, I want to stress again that the water security nexus must pay attention to land, right? We can't treat water, I mean, as academics, as people, we try to abstract water from the land that it's on, even though that's absurd if you think about it. Water has to flow on land. Water is related to land. But we tend to abstract water away from the land that it flows on, and we can't do that. I think we have to put land back in the mix. And the fact that this may seem to many to be an old debate, left over from the 50s or 60s, is not relevant. It might be an old debate, but the problem is still there. You have incredible land inequality, and that results in poverty and insecurity for many people. And we talk about in the report how anecdotal evidence suggests that these dispossessed people who used to have tenurial rights but are now landless laborers, they don't have many options, you know? So where do they turn to, you know? And the scary suggestion is perhaps they turn to militant groups. I want to just finish by saying that before the Green Revolution in the 60s, it was actually intellectually acceptable to talk about land reform as a way to increase the security of people. The land reforms in Taiwan, in Pakistan, in India, these were all supported by the US security establishment. So we have to think creatively. It's not just technological fixes that are going to chart the way forward. We have to look at questions of marginality, power, and access to the means of subsistence. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Majid. I think we'll go now to Dr. Yu, and then we'll try at the end to come back to Danish, see if we can reconnect with him.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to share with you some thoughts, ideas, and experiences. I've been working in Pakistan now for almost 7-8 years, mostly on investment lending and operations. So reading this report very much resonated with me. I must admit, as an engineer, reading a report that emphasizes the fact that actually the technical solutions are not really key, but it's institutional, pains me a little bit. But I must admit that after working in Pakistan for so many years, it is indeed true. The water resource management challenges in Pakistan, in my view, are sort of twofold. On the one hand, you've got a certain amount of water that you are trying to maximize let's say, the constructive role that it plays. And just, if we think abstractly, water serves many purposes, as Dr. Akhtar mentioned. The Indus Basin irrigation system is very much the lifeline of the country. If you imagine this irrigation system not existing, you're essentially dealing with an arid environment, so nothing is possible. So one of the nexuses that we think about is the food security part, and that's what I've been most interested and most focused on the last several years. We also, and I think the report also mentions this, there's obviously also the energy side of it. As we know, as we actually have ourselves experienced, there's an energy crisis happening in Pakistan. Demand supply doesn't meet. And so what is the role of hydropower? Can we maximize the potential for generation? So on the one hand, as a water manager, whether you are at the farm level or you're at the provincial level or at the national level, you're trying to maximize that potential. But on the other hand, as is mentioned in the report, there's this other side, which is you're trying to minimize the destructive role that water can play. We saw in 2010 extreme floods. If you look at the ADB damage losses report, $1 billion worth of damages from one single event. Okay, I mean, that's a huge thing. And not only do you have floods, you have droughts. I spent quite a bit of time working in Balochistan, spent a lot of time in Quetta, very Martian landscape, very, very dry. The crezzes there, if they're not functioning, you can't grow anything. Okay, so how does one minimize those extremes? Okay, so in some sense, whenever I see these water security indices and people talk about, a certain, 1,000 cubic meters per capita is what is required, for me, I don't really see that as actually that important. Whether you're a little bit below it or a little bit above it, it hardly matters. I can probably find you as many examples of countries that are below that index that are doing fine, and as many countries that are above that water security index that are doing poorly, right? So I think, what Andrew mentioned earlier, the politics of distribution, allocation, and access. I like that terminology because I think that very much encompasses this idea that it's all about institutions, it's all about management, it's all about governance. And again, as an engineer, I'm saying this very, very forcefully and strongly. Now, I haven't really prepared any comments. I just wanted to maybe make a few comments, offer a few thoughts on the report. Dinesh started to talk a little bit about climate change. Just to selfishly plug, we just completed a fairly extensive report with UMass Amherst, and many of you who've worked on the Indus know Jim Westcote at MIT, looking at climate change issues and what it means for water security in the Indus Basin. And I think much of the sentiment that Dinesh was starting to share was very much what we found also. We looked at the entire Indus system and asked these questions. Well, what if these projections out to 2050, 2100 were here today? What would that look like? Okay, so ran a lot of models, found 3% drop in GDP growth, 10% drop in ag GDP growth, 5% drop in household income, doom and doom and doom and doom. But the good news is that if you make small improvements in efficiency, okay, you improve efficiency throughout the irrigated system by 5-10%. If you are able to improve crop yields, okay, by a small amount, if you're able to improve the amount of storage you have in the system, all of these things can wipe out all of these negative impacts that we model. Okay, so in a lot of ways, I don't feel that I'm not as pessimistic as some people, let's just say that. On this issue of storage, in my personal view, we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, okay? And certainly the recent, I would say the last several decades, focus has been on supply side solutions. Now, I do think that conservation and demand side solutions are absolutely critical. The more difficult question is what is the appropriate balance? And I'd like to maybe pose a question for the audience, which is there some minimum amount of storage that is absolutely required for countries to achieve water security, however we may define that? Okay, I think many of you who are familiar with the variety of bank reports, you've seen this wonderful graph of the amount of storage per capita across different countries. So the United States has 6,000, around 6,000 plus cubic meters available of storage per capita. Pakistan, hardly 100. Okay, so if you look at how much storage you have available to store over a year, okay, Pakistan does not have that. So when we talk about the destructive role that I mentioned earlier, how we minimize the impacts of floods and droughts, conservation will not help us with that. We do need some kind of supply solution. And it may not necessarily be big dams. It could be small, medium-sized dams. It could be groundwater storage. It could be any number of things. So I think, I don't want to overly push the idea of storage, but I think that does pose a question for us to consider, which is, how much do countries actually need? In a study that Casey Brown, a colleague at UMass Amherst, did, he looked at storage and storage as a determinant of growth, and he does see some relationship there. So, why is it that countries that do have some modicum of control of these large river systems, why are they showing higher growth rates than other countries? So, to just conclude, I think the report and the recommendations in it were quite good, certainly resonated very loudly with me. I think the institutional aspects and as Andrew mentioned, the intra-state issues are quite contentious. One thing, if you're interested in this climate change report that we completed, you can find it on the World Bank website. One thing we looked at in our work, we said, well, what if we tried to maximize as much agricultural income as possible and removed all of the current intra-provincial constraints? Because as many of you know, there is an accord that says a certain amount of water goes to Sindh, a certain amount to Punjab, and so forth. What we found is that if we remove those constraints, the pie actually gets bigger. Okay, the amount of economic production as possible increases. And that's not only because of reallocation between provinces, but it's also because of reallocation within provinces. Okay, so if we were to move more to an economically based, market-based allocation approach, we see that there are gains to be made. Now, obviously, for me to go to Pakistan and say, get rid of this accord is complete nonsense. Who am I to say that? I mean, this is obviously a political solution. But, as an academic, it gives us some insight as to how much more is possible if the provinces were to re-look at the accord and how water is distributed both within their provinces and also between provinces. So I'll just leave it there and we can leave it later for questions. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Can we try connecting again? Bear with us 1 minute. Actually, while we're trying to do that, Natalie, do you want to go ahead? Yeah, go ahead and make, and hopefully we'll get Danish back. Again, for those who arrived late, Natalie is the third co-author of this paper. So.
Yes, and is it on? Here? Oh, it's on? Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to add much to this because, my colleagues have covered this well and you have the report also to read and make your conclusions. But I want to draw your attention to something that I found very unique with this study and that we tried to present, and that was, yeah, that's better, is the section that we have on the perceptions of how water problems are perceived from the different stakeholders. We've spoken that, the institutional and governance reforms are needed, but, ultimately it comes down to the political will of, water managers and water stakeholders in Pakistan. And, with the few interviews that we did during this, short study, we found that those that are in power, those that are making the decisions on what kind of reforms are needed or what kind of projects are going to be doing to solve the water problems, they have very little incentive to make meaningful changes. They may be the landowners, the big landowners that are benefiting from, taking big chunks of land. And you have those that work in the water sector, and they do focus on the supply side engineering projects. And I don't want to de-emphasize the need for storage. But there needs to be maintenance and governance of these structures. And once these projects are built, oftentimes in Pakistan, they tend to be ignored and fail. And their solution to fix that problem is to go back and build a new one. So we need to get into to solve it with institutional maintenance. And there's also a deep mistrust and perpetual disputes that prevent the provincial leaders from working together, and that is deeply rooted in the political aspects as well. And this is where water security from a political perspective is coming into play. And so there is a need for more cooperation between these water managers and stakeholders, and to build programs and projects that encourage meaningful reforms. So without addressing these perceptions, it's going to be difficult to ease the water tensions. And so we've highlighted that. So thank you.
Thanks. Any luck? And are we?
Nadia, are you able to hear us? They can hear us. We can't see that.
Okay, while we're waiting, do we have any questions from the audience? We might start getting a discussion going. Yeah. If you can just identify yourself. If you come to a speaker, and then, there we go. Just identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Saf Ahmed with DOD. I wanted to thank you guys, first of all, for coming here. Mazda, I had a question for you. You mentioned land reforms peripherally in India and Bangladesh, and I was just wondering if you've done any research on the effects those had on water use, because I know, frankly, land reforms in India play a huge part in their development as a democracy and connecting the electorate to the elected officials, which is happening slowly in Pakistan. And the other thing, just a comment I wanted to make, was that in both politically, economically, one of Pakistan's main problems at a social and cultural level is that they're all looking for, the golden ticket. And change, progress is incremental. And so I think part of the issue that you're going to have is, especially on the demand side of things, is educating people. And anyway, I'll let you get back to the answer to that question. Thank you.
Should we take one other question and then come back to the panel? Any? Yeah.
Amanda Mayoral. I work here at the Institute. Dr. Akhtar, I had a question about the comment you made where usually it's interesting to look at the productivity, as you said, in water usage. But you said that it's also, and maybe more important, to look at the employment and the subsistence usage of the water. And I thought that was an interesting change of pace, and I thought maybe could you explain more as to, is it a complementing perspective to look at the employment, or is the efficiency use still an important indicator, or is that really not something that we should be looking at in terms of the effect of conflict? Could you extrapolate more on that comment? Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions from both. For Saif, land reforms and democracy is what I understood your question to be, or land reforms and water use? In Bangladesh and India. I actually have not done, this is kind of a new direction that I want to take in my research. I'm very interested in it. But I do think from the experience of Taiwan and China and South Korea, that these are, like the so-called East Asian miracle, is actually a lot, some scholars say a lot of it can be traced back to effective land reforms. Because those were land reforms in these, not China, but in South Korea and Taiwan, were implemented as an anti-communist strategy. In other words, you're going to have so much unrest and kind of, peasant agitation going on that land reforms are actually an effective counter to that. And that's just as an example. And many people say that in East Pakistan, they've actually reduced this kind of thing that Pakistanis always talk about, the feudal element. It was weaker there to begin with. That might be part of the explanation, but also it was more land reforms that were more forcefully pushed through. So I mean, it's a complicated question. I'm not suggesting that say it and it will be done, but I do think that it needs to begin with people taking it seriously and putting it back on the agenda. And your question about the golden ticket and education and kind of gradualism towards progress, I agree. I mean, take these last elections, people might say, oh, it was rigged, it was this, it was that, blah, blah, blah. I mean, but still it's a step, and I do think step by step, that's how things get better. In terms of education, some of the most rapacious people in Pakistan are the most educated. Let me just put it that way. The people the top bureaucracy, the top military, they're all very fancy degrees, they're very, very well educated. Nevertheless, that hasn't seen, I would just kind of, it is a kind of a foundation of liberal thought that education is always necessarily good and will lead to better outcomes. I would just say that maybe that's not so firm, that education is not a ticket to good policy. I'm not saying it's bad either, but I'm just saying it's you have to look at what's actually happening on the ground.
I'm going to interrupt here and seize the moment because I think we might have Danish back on the line, and then we can come back and answer the second question. But Danish, if you can hear us, I think we'll try to turn back to you and try to finish your presentation. So apologies for that glitch.
Just to finish my comments really good, and I guess I can also respond to some of the comments that were already made by Dr. Yu and Majid. I think the question about land reforms is a very important one that Majid raised, but I think it would also be useful to, if you're talking about water, to also think about how water can also be used as a surrogate while you're waiting for the land reforms to happen. I think there are some very fundamental equity issues that need to be addressed in the realm of water. Simple example. Abhiana, water charges in Pakistan, they have not been changed in the past 40 years. Second of all, they're uniform all across the system. Now, everybody would agree water charges at the beginning of a canal are a completely different thing from what the water charges are at the tail end of a watercourse. Even though you're saying that you have a certain amount of time, but because of seepage losses, the water quantities that they get at the end, at the beginning of the water courses is very different. Now, guess what? Thanks to the British settlement policies from the past, you tend to have poorer farmers and smaller farmers at the tail end of water courses and larger farmers at the head of a water course. How about if one could possibly calibrate the water charges, increase them substantively at the head of a water course and reduce them substantively at the tail end of the water course? Automatically, what you're trying to do is trying to introduce some semblance of equity in a system which was actually designed to be inequitable. It's a design flaw. It's not something that we created, that we came up with, that post-independence Pakistanis thought completely went nuts and thought, how can we screw the poor people? That wasn't what it was about. It was designed to be inequitable. How about addressing some of those fundamental design flaws of the system? So to address the same issue about equity. Second thing I'd like to address is the whole issue of storage. As far as I understand, there are three kinds of storage in the water realm. One is in glaciers in the cryosphere. You can store water. And by the way, no sane person in the realm of water resources will ever say that they are against storage. Storage is a good thing. The question is, what kind of storage are we talking about? First is cryosphere, glaciers. There's nothing we can do about that. That's just naturally that happens. The second one is surface storage, right, which is most popular amongst us humans because it makes for dams and, nice lakes. You can go jet skiing in there, in the US at least. But that happens to be relatively expensive. In fact, the most expensive way of storing, and also happens to be the most inefficient way of storing, particularly in a country like Pakistan, where today, I think a couple of days back, the temperature is 46 degrees Celsius. And the kind of topography that you get and the kind of lakes that you're going to build in Pakistan with the kind of storage, surface storage that one is talking about, I don't think it's the most efficient way of going about it. By all means, if there's a need for it, I'm not like ideologically against that, just trying to point that out. And the third kind of storage is groundwater. If there's a fourth kind, I'm all ears, but there's groundwater. Pakistan sits on top of one of the largest aquifers in the world. And there's practically no articulated policy, no articulated way of regulating, of controlling, or developing groundwater resources in Pakistan. To this day, in Pakistan, let me point out something. The system is designed for famine prevention. It is not designed to produce cotton that Pakistan exports and is the largest exporter in the world of. For famine prevention, it was designed for 62% cropping intensities. And today, the cropping intensity is about 150 to 200%. Where is the extra water coming from? 60 to 80% of the water in the irrigation system of Pakistan is coming from groundwater. And what do we have to say about it? How much research do we have about it? Very little compared to the surface water. So I think the debate needs to be opened up a little bit when it comes to water storage, if you will. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is I wasn't able to talk so because it's Institute of Peace. I think we need to think about what are the sorts of consequences for peace. Again, I think that we are not trying to steer people towards a sort of a billiard ball kind of a causation. Oh, people get poor, they don't get enough water, they get thrown off the land, so they pick up a gun and go fight somewhere. It doesn't quite work like that, of course not. And I hope that nobody walks away from this report thinking that that is our message. What we're trying to say is that it causes a bunch of stresses, which at the end of the day, combined with other factors, may lead to the sorts of problems of violence, of civil unrest that we're kind of concerned with. I've seen manifestation of that, as Dr. Yu rightly pointed out, in Balochistan with the collapse of the Kare system. I've seen the same thing happening. I worked in southern Pakistan, which, by the way, guess what? Most of the Pakistani Taliban actually come from southern Punjab, where you get precisely that sort of a difference or a distance between the haves and the have-nots. And to my mind, there's a lot of transboundary issues. It's exciting, it's interesting. National Defense University over here likes to talk about it a lot. But I think that the real security threat, the security and water nexus that I see is really at the local level. It really is at the local level. Thanks to Green Revolution, thanks to small farmers being dispossessed, getting kicked off the land, many of these armies showing up in shanty towns and very urban areas all over small town Pakistan as well as larger cities. Young people who've been basically relieved from the sort of community controls that are there can get up to all sorts of mischief. It can be anywhere from picking pockets and highway robbery to all the way to the kinds of things that the world seems to care about, which is about turning towards extremism and all. So I think that those sorts of connections are really, really important for us to be mindful of. And if that becomes the reason for us to do right, if you will, by the Pakistani farmer, I agree with land reform. It's a very good idea. I think it needs to be done. It is almost a moral imperative that we have that. But while one is fighting that very uphill kind of a political battle, water can be, I would argue, a surrogate, if you will, for, if not equalizing, but certainly adding some semblance of equity. Because it's not just on the land front that the poor people are getting the raw end of the stick. It also happens to be on the water. And there are some very sensible kinds of suggestions that can be thrown in there beyond the simple market mechanism that seems to be favored by many international consultants and donors in Pakistan, that can actually lead to equity gains in Pakistan and provide some semblance of sustainability. Because bear in mind, this is my last word, bear in mind, in Pakistan, water is not just about productivity. Water is not just about productivity. It is also about identity. I asked this farmer, and his house had been bulldozed by the large farmer, and I said, why don't you go to the city, and there's plenty of opportunity to work and that sort of thing over there. Why hang out over here? And he said to me in his very lilting sort of Punjabi, that's who I am. That's who I have always been. That's my pride and my identity. And you were to give me whatever, I cannot give up who I am. Farming is not just about bringing food, putting food on the table or a livelihood. It's also a very deeply entrenched cultural identity. And you take that away from people. I often give an example that nobody in this audience would ever, if I were to say, who are you? None of you would tell me your salary. Because the salary is not important. Every one of you will introduce yourself as somebody, hey, I'm a researcher, I work at such and such, I work at such and such, I work at such and such. And that is a part of who you are. That is how you identify yourself to the rest of the world. A Pakistani farmer identifies himself or herself, and by mind you, there are a lot of female Pakistani farmers out there. That's how they introduce themselves and think of themselves. And taking that away and throwing them out in a shanty town of Quetta or Karachi is a catastrophe which is pretty much unthinkable for us. And the consequences that emerge from that is something that we have to be very, very attentive to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we were able to get you back on the line. Let's go back to some more questions from the audience. I know we had one back there. Do you still have your question? We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panelists.
Hi, Jeremy Chen over at the State Department, and thank you very much for the presentation and the report. Look forward to reading it. My question relates towards currently, of course. There was an election that happened just a couple weeks ago, and we have the new government coming in. I haven't seen a lot said on water. Certainly their focus is on energy and in the current energy crisis. But what do you experts, researchers see as the possibilities of any change or reform or even looking at this issue on the water from the new government, the PMLN? So.
I had one, and I'd just like to maybe get more of a discussion going, I think, in terms of the storage, supply side, demand side issue, because we had differing perspectives there, and I think it's certainly not an either or thing. But I guess maybe throw out a challenge to you in terms of on the institutional side and demand side, clearly very important, but also there's reasons why so little progress has been made because of the political will issues, the vested interests. And when I hear that on one hand you have every political party but the MQM, plus the military, plus all the entrenched industrial interests, whatever, and then peasants on the other, my bet is that the former is going to win out on this rather than the latter, potentially. And in terms of moving, one reason maybe why there's a bit more focus on storage is because maybe there's a sense that could be more doable in the political climate. What could you do to change that kind of dynamic? I get that in terms of the political will, and I guess that maybe even relates to this election-related issue. Danish, do you want to go back to you? And then we also had the question from Emily from before. So do you want to start off?
What was Emily's question? If you could just remind me real quick.
Sorry, Amanda. Sorry.
Amanda, my question was, is the comment was made that looking at the changes in employment and how subsidence is being addressed for water issues might be a better use of our attention than on the marginal productivity of the water that we're getting out, and maybe that shouldn't be the focus. Or and my question was, is it a complementing indicator to look at, or is the marginal productivity just something we should not really be focusing on? If you were to produce a paper and look at indicators and, the employment, is that going to be the first one we're looking at? And what is it about the employment that you found that was really important for the switch?
All right. Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I taking the first question regarding new government's attention towards water. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, the water debate has become a little too ossified. Part of the problem might be that in Pakistan there are very few real, shall we say, and this is going to make me very unpopular, so kindly please don't tell any Pakistani experts that you know that I said this, that there aren't really a lot of Pakistan, water experts. Most of them are civil engineers who happen to have gotten a job in the irrigation department and spent about 30, 40 years actually doing, on the job kind of work. So it's basically experiential knowledge, not formal training in water, if you will. How many process geomorphologists are there in Pakistan? I don't know of any. I've gone through up and down the bureaucracy of Pakistan. I have not come across a single process geomorphologist. How many hydrologists are there in Pakistan? Not really that many. It's basically civil engineers. The point I'm trying to make is that this debate has become ossified between to build or not to build a dam. That's what the debate is about. And it has also become aligned with certain ethno-nationalist interests. It is scary because many of my colleagues in Pakistan, I'm just one of those people who would fit in anywhere in Pakistan because of my background and everything. So everybody thinks that I'm one of them. So Punjabi ones, say to me, we really need to build a dam. Of course, you understand that that's what we need to do. The Sindhis want to say to me, we should not allow the dam to be built. The point is that the present government is on record as trying to keep its Punjabi constituency by promising the building of the dams, the mega dams. And I am very pessimistic about the prospects of this particular government trying to open up the debate a little more, diversifying a little bit more. I'm just simply not very optimistic that either there is enough institutional inertia within Pakistan or there is political will to open up the debate and to talk about water in interesting and creative ways. As I said, Pakistan has storage. It's groundwater. They have it already. It's the biggest storage than anything they could get off of any dam. Mind you, let me also remind you, and this is relevant to floods as well, the dam building principles, the whole engineering principles and everything were essentially figured out in the American West and Western Europe. Pakistan has rivers which have the highest silt flows in the world. You don't like it, take it up with God. It just happens to be a geologically young mountains in the Himalayas which have the highest silt flows in the world. Indus has higher silt flows than the Amazon. You want to build a dam on it, be my guest, build it. In the most seismically active zone in the world, in the Basha Dam, feel free. Nobody's stopping you. But for heaven's sakes, look at a few other options that are there in Pakistan that can also be addressed. And I'm very pessimistic about the prospects of having that sort of a debate opening up a little more. Nobody's for and against. Let's not equate, if you're pro-dam, you are a patriotic Pakistani, and if you're anti-dam, you're somehow some sort of a mongrel, Indian American agent trying to steal Pakistani news. That's what the last thing about employment, Amanda's question is a very excellent one. I often say to people, I think it would be a fascinating little study to do. American farmers are supposed to be the most productive ones in the world. Now, if you really look at the amount of energy that the American farmers put in to the land to pull out the caloric energy that they actually produce from the land, you would not probably find that energy to energy balance of their productivity very complementary. But if you compare the Pakistani farmer to the amount of inputs, energy that the Pakistani farmer puts into the land and the energy that he derives from it, you'd find a very favorable sort of an equation over there. So the idea is that the employment part of it is paramount in a Pakistani society. Certainly if you're thinking of it in terms of social stability, certainly if you're thinking in terms of historical continuity and livelihoods and culture, you're thinking of water in that multidimensional sense. If water is just another factor of production to be used and pressed into service to get maximum productivity per liter of water, then there are all sorts of uses. I'm often reminded of, I used to teach water management in the American West, University of Colorado, and I used to give an example to my students that the most economically productive use of water is in fact the fountains outside of MGM Grand Casino in Las Vegas. Liter to dollar, that is the most productive use of water. is that the most morally or socially responsible use of water is a question that the society has to answer. And I think if you think of it in broader terms, then I think Majid's point about employment has to be taken into account.
Thank you, Majid. Then we'll go.
Okay, so I'll start with Amanda, who's been very patient, asked that question a while ago. You're asking about the complementarity of efficiency and equality metrics, or if there's one metric that can capture both. I'm not sure that there is. I mean, the story that we've been hearing for a long time is that greater efficiency will lead to, a rising tide lifts all boats, trickle down, however you want to put it. The idea that the common sense in policy circles, academic circles, is that if you increase production and efficiency, everyone will benefit and equality will also be served. I mean, this is a long-running debate, whether that actually is the case. But I think what I'm suggesting is not to throw production and efficiency out the window, but make them subservient to equality. Not say we're going to be productive and efficient and wait for equality later, but do it the other way around. We're going to focus on equality and equity issues and then worry about production and efficiency as they meet those equality goals. And I would recommend that you look at Robert Wade's book. It's called Managing Canal Irrigation, Practical Analysis from South Asia. I think it's from 89 or something like that. That's an excellent book, and it's a pity that it hasn't been picked up enough, in my opinion. For Jeremy, who asked the question about elections, and we were just chatting a bit before that one of the starkest kind of results of this election is the provincialization of the party's support. So you have each party getting its support from a geographically concentrated area. Now, Punjab is the most populous, so Nawaz Sharif's party has what looks on paper, without any spatial variation, to be overwhelming majority support. But if you look at the geography of it, you'll actually see it's not so simple. And so what I think in terms of water, the issues will be, there's several issues, but they revolve around center-province tensions, the kind of tensions we discuss in this report. For example, Nawaz Sharif and Punjab, Nawaz Sharif has a development platform. I'll give you roads and power, you keep voting me in. It looks like this type of deal is developing between the electorate, Punjabi electorate, and Nawaz Sharif. So I worry that he might be tempted to push through Kalabagh Dam without kind of attention to the Federation. That's an open question, but I would be on the lookout for that. And then second, there's been talk of a new province, and I think even been cleared by the parliament, but we're not seeing the implementation just yet. But that new province in southern Punjab, the Saraiki belt, that's going to throw the inter-provincial allocations into disarray. We'll have to revisit those. Like, you have a new province, what's its take of the water? And actually, South Punjab historically has been even more marginal than Sindh in terms of water access. That's something I got from my interviews that I did during my field research. So I would say those are some of the issues that we have to we should not look forward to, but pay attention to. Is that these elections, while fantastic, they happen, military was not visibly on the scene, that's great, but I worry for the Federation, basically. The geography of democracy is, I think, we have to pay attention to. And then finally, the question of whether the odds are stacked against land reforms or any type of solution that hints at this type of structural transformation. And I would say that actually, out of all the people who have challenged the structure, the poor peasants have been the most successful. They haven't paid the army for the past 10 years. They've fought back, one of the largest and most vicious armies in the world. These poor peasants have kept them out of their villages, So I actually think that we have to kind of see what's happening on the ground. The new media won't report on this so much. The military doesn't like to talk about it. The power players don't like to talk about it. But I really do think that we have to look at ground realities, and we have to look at where the successful challenges to these entrenched power brokers are coming from. And I'm actually quite hopeful, because I do think there's been in the past 10 years, especially since the lawyers' movement, a politicization of Pakistan's middle and upper middle classes. And you can look at the success of the Tehreek-Insaf, Imran Khan's party, which I don't support, but I see it as a hopeful sign that there is this newfound politicization of the middle and upper middle classes in Pakistan. And historically, these are the classes that kind of lead or a catalyst for big changes. So my hope is that by changing the conversation, we will be able to slowly, gradually change structural realities as well. Thanks.
Yeah, just two responses. One on Amanda's question. I think in the rural space, a lot depends on what your objective is. If your objective is to raise farmer incomes, it's obviously a very complex little ecosystem. There is no, I think someone said golden ticket or no silver bullet in these spaces. Productivity, we know both water productivity and agricultural productivity is low, so there's tremendous scope for improvement. Efficiency, even the word efficiency is a little bit problematic because what are we talking about when we say irrigation efficiency? I mean, because you have a leaky canal, that water is still going somewhere and still being used potentially by somebody else, right? So even the idea of efficiency in an irrigation system is not clear-cut. Are you talking about system efficiency, or are you talking about just one particular outlet efficiency, and so forth and so forth? So, what I work on is primarily on the agriculture sector. So what I'm trying to improve are yields, because I believe that will lead to higher farmer incomes, but that's not always the case. I mean, I can improve yields for a crop that there's no market for, so it doesn't actually do anything from the farmer perspective. So just something to think about, really, what is your objective? And I think you'll find that, once you set that objective, getting to that is not always easy. On Denisha's comment about, engineers, I think this is an issue worldwide. I mean, everywhere I've worked in South Asia, when I'm dealing with traditional irrigation departments, we're always dealing with civil engineers. And part of that is a generational thing. I think, as Saif mentioned, I think change is a very long-term process. And the engineers who were trained, who we are working with now, didn't have the same type of upbringing that new engineers have. Back in the 50s, you were taught structures, you were taught concrete, you were taught very, that kind of discipline. But nowadays, engineering programs are a little bit more multidisciplinary. You are exposed much more to ideas of sustainability, economics, social issues, environmental issues. So I think that kind of turnover in staffing, I think, will take quite a bit of time. And it's something I see in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, so forth and so forth. So I think, yes, very heavy focus on the engineering aspect, but I think that will change with the new generation of engineers coming around.
Thanks. I think we have time for another round of questions.
Hello, my name is Penelope Poole, and thank you so much. It's very encouraging that this conversation is continuing. I represent a firm, Rogerbeck Consulting Incorporated. We emerged out of an applied research project in Afghanistan, doing exactly the kinds of things that Dr. Yu was saying could be done in small incremental measures. And I really wanted to just share some information, such as one of the things that our foresters and water people discovered was that the dams that are being built in Afghanistan and Pakistan are actually just collecting silt, and there's not a lot of donor attention being paid to the upper watershed management. And we consider our experts, who I hope are listening. We have one of them in Pakistan right now doing the master plan in northern Pakistan, and Dr. Ruffner, who just returned from Afghanistan and is trying to get this message across to the Army Corps of Engineers, who have just are in the process of spending $200 million to raise the Dala Dam by 8 meters, and it's only going to last 5 years unless some attention is paid to the upper watersheds. And the other sort of critical piece that I think is worth sharing is that we discovered through diagnostic analysis that by measuring the flow rate in along the canals when they take their turn, is that more is not necessarily better for many crops, and actually the middle area of the canal received much greater yield than the head of the canal. And in fact, if you were to share that headwater with the tail, then you'd have a very good crop. So it's a matter of educating and at the local level and engaging villagers, and especially the mirabs, the village water masters, to understand all of these new technicalities that they weren't aware of before.
Thank you. Any questions? Behind, and then you.
Hi, I'm Susan Shiflett from the Woodrow Wilson Center's China Environment Forum. Thank you so much for all your wonderful remarks. I definitely appreciate that water security is often a local issue and one about livelihoods, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to entertain the more sort of geopolitical security issue, and perhaps, Dr. you might want to be able to address with the headwaters of the Indus River being located in Chinese-controlled Tibet. What sort of geopolitical issues do you see with Pakistan? Have there been? I mean, I know that on the Brahmaputra River that flows from China into India, that there has been controversy over some of the proposed dams, although China says that they are run-of-the-river dams. So I'm just curious to know if you could give some perspective in terms of the Indus River and possible implications for Pakistan and the region. Thanks.
Okay, then Saif.
Hi, Saf again. Danish, I wanted to thank you for bringing up what I thought was a very important point. I mean, the identity thing. India derives its name from the Indus River. And also, Danish, I'm sorry, I'm going to quote back some of your own work to you, but my understanding of the Garner system is that the first use of the water, the land that it goes to, also gets the last use of the water, and it's culturally and historically a very equitable system. And I wanted to know if there's any comparable equities in the traditional irrigation systems in the Punjab and Sindh in particular. Thank you.
Any one last question? Okay, one last question.
I'll just be very brief. Do you have any suggestions on how foreign actors, donors, governments should interact with Pakistan on water?
Good. Danish, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, why don't we start off with you?
I will just, the geopolitical part I'll leave to Dr. Yu. Just real quick, just a comment that it seems that the water issue is unfortunately being majorly securitized here in Pakistan. It seems like the military and National Defense University over here seem to think that it would be a good idea if they get an oversight over the Indus River, Indus Commissioner on part of Pakistan. So that securitization of water that is happening in Pakistan does not bode well for how might this be leveraged to perhaps, hostilities or what have you. There's a whole set of issues there with regards to data sharing by India and others, and that there's a lot published out, maybe we can keep about that. Regarding Garner system, thanks so much for. In Garner system is a lot more equitable indeed. Unfortunately, it's under a lot of stress, as you well know. But in the Punjab was Western Punjab, where Pakistan is right now, was mostly settled in 1865. With the building of the Upper Bari Canal and so on. I think Martin knows the story in greater detail than I do. I'm rusty on that. So that system was essentially built by the British to essentially replicate the English hierarchical rural society in the Punjab. They thought that they were able to settle down the agro-pastoralist societies that occupied the western half of the Indus Basin. They could presumably ensure greater stability, greater idleness, commodity empire, and hence the sorts of inequities that are there within the Pakistani irrigation system were actually deliberately built into this system. It was not just an experiment in physical engineering, it was also one of the grandest experiments in social engineering, not just physical but social engineering. So the kind of equitable aspects that you got, because Khare's system dates for thousands, hundreds of years, not thousands of years. So those have a much greater sort of a pedigree in the culture and history of the region. The Punjab irrigation system is essentially a 120, 130-year-old system. Everything is codified, it is written in the text, and that's how it goes. I think it would be a fascinating piece of research to actually start going into where the system has not penetrated. What are the sorts of systems that are in place over there? The rain-fed irrigation that is going on in some parts of the country. I think that would be fascinating research. I haven't done much on it. At some point, that would be worth doing. And I think the last question was what? What was the last question?
Danish, we're struggling to hear a little bit.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me well?
Maybe a bit better. We'll turn off the video and see if, okay. And then if just another minute or two, and then we'll wind up with our other panelists.
What the donors can do, for example, first of all, induction of that diverse disciplines in the Pakistani water bureaucracy. If somehow the international donors can facilitate multidisciplinary inductions, recruitments, change of recruitment policies, I think that would be a great service in the longer run. That would be very, very useful. Second thing is, for example, just with the Khare system, I have tried real hard to get donors interested in these indigenous systems, which with a very minimum amount of capital and technical assistance would very reasonably be protected. So help with or drawing attention of these very modernist Pakistani engineers towards the more indigenous water management systems, which could be the ticket towards more sustainable water development. I'd let the others speak to other recommendations.
Thank you. Majid?
Yeah, so I guess on Tibetan geopolitics and rivers coming out of Tibet, there's Brahma Chelani, if you've read that book, Water Wars, right. So I have a review of that book that should come out in Antipode, which kind of criticizes it for these kind of Malthusian assumptions that we're all going to fight each other, and that's the way the story ends and must end. I think that there are tensions, of course, that we must realize, but it's a complicated issue, and I do think the international water law here is very interesting. The fact that India has water treaties with all its neighbors, but China doesn't, and I think that there's, it's a very big topic, but let me just suffice it to say that it's much more nuanced than just population equals conflict. I think that there's a lot going on there. So that was that. I think just to, I'll finish my comments on this, is that a lot of questions are coming up about canals and Penelope's comments about the middle reaches being more productive. I actually do think that as a geographer, I'm also very attuned to location and area and space. And I think this also goes with the Khare's system and Danish's comments about differential rates for heads and tails. I do think that it would be a big step for us to take space seriously in this context and look at locations of farmers and see how location impacts, efficiency, equity, class, caste. All these issues are expressed through location in the canal colonies and the canal areas of Pakistan. So this is, we cite one scholar, Muhammad Latif, from the University of Engineering and Technology, who's done a bit of work on this, looking at how location actually impacts equity in production. And I think we need a lot more of that type of research. But I think just from a few of the comments that have gone around that highlighted the importance of location on a micro level, I would say I'm very interested in those issues as well. And I don't have any suggestions for foreign donors. Sorry, I don't know what to say.
Okay, so real quick, I mean, the Indus is largely a Pakistan-India river basin. Very small portion of it is in China and Afghanistan. I think actually Andrew's comment earlier about the AFPAC dimension perhaps playing a larger role in the future. I think that might be more critical than even the China aspect. The comparison to the Brahmaputra is very different, right? I mean, China, in terms of the Brahmaputra and the amount of the basin that's in China, it's much greater. Also, in that part, you're dealing with glaciers, and I think, one thing that we did in our recent studies, we looked at glacial contributions to the total amount of water that comes into the Indus. And when it's all said and done, it's only about 15%. So the large remainder of the amount of water that comes into the system is coming from winter precipitation as snow. And this is where, actually, when we think about climate change in the future, we all have we're all coming to a consensus on what we think future temperatures will be. And it's those temperatures which govern how glaciers melt. But we have very wide range of estimates when it comes to precipitation. And that's what I think is most interesting, is that the thing that's most important for the Indus system and the total water availability is the thing that is most unknown to us. Okay, so I think like Danish was saying, all these estimates, plus 50%, plus minus, I mean, what do you do in that situation? So going back to the China part, I mean, I don't, I'm not in a position really to say, but I think, it's something to keep certainly our eyes open on.
Thank you, and I can't resist the temptation to refer to a little bit of my own in the context of elections, dissertation research on the electoral politics in the Punjab, because just how important to this day some of the decisions made, a century and a half ago on water distribution still play in today's electoral politics in the Punjab. And again, when the colonial powers were putting in the largest canal irrigation system in the world in the Punjab, and allocating land on initially based on what would be the productive unit of about 25 acres squares to yeoman farmers, but then after what was referred in the West as the Indian Mutiny and referred there as the First War of Independence, land started getting allocated based on control and power issues. So much larger holdings and created what in Pakistan is termed, a little bit inaccurately, I think, is this feudal class in southern Punjab. And to this day, the voting behavior of central Punjab, where you had these smaller allocations of land, versus southern Punjab, where you had these larger allocations of canal that were developed post mutiny, War of Independence, a very distinctive voting behavior. So again, this back to the politics of distribution, allocation, access, still playing a very important role in Pakistani politics. So, but I think we'll wind up there. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks very much to our panelists, and thank you very much for Danish for putting up with our technical glitches, as well as the audience. But and a final word of thanks to Jeremy Moore, who did a lot of the organization for this event. So a big hand to all.